Hello and welcome to this video defining beer. Beer is of course the golden amber liquid that they pour by the pint in pubs. Or is it? Beer is defined as being made from barley, hops, water and yeast, in the strictest sense. That is the Reinheitsgebot German beer purity laws. If we stick to that, then anything that uses wheat, rye and similar would not be beer. This obviously means the definition is much too strict. It cuts out things like wheat beer. It cuts out things like wheat beer that are, by their very name, beer. On the other hand, if we left the definition of beer too loose and just said anything made from grains alone was enough, then we'd have to accept sake, and rice wine is a weird and niche area. There are also various recipes for locally produced alcohols that call for rice, corn, potatoes, and other less common starch sources. They are more viable to produce locally than traditional grains are, but they're not a grain. We then have to ask about hops. These are used not just in beer, but that is one of the most common applications. There are some beers that are low hops, but can you do away with hops altogether? Unlike cider that relies on fruit and specifically apples, beer is grain-based in most cases. The catch is that you can add fruit to beer, but not grains to cider. Yeast for the most purposes of this is yeast, but there are some features to beer yeast that are noteworthy. Now that we know that there is some overlap between different parts of what beer should be and is at least defined as, we can look at other fermented beverages and try to define it using some sort of official sources. Beer has a generally used working definition of an alcoholic beverage made by brewing and fermenting cereals. This is that reference to grains. Normally, it's referencing malted barley, and then hops are added for a bitter flavour. The combination of both hops as a flavouring agent and the use of malted barley along with other cereals gives us both a narrow but wide definition that gives flexibility in what we can define beer as. Broadly speaking, it can just be said beer is made from grains with some sort of extra flavouring. Grains as they are can be malted or left unprocessed. Malting though is commonly used because it adds a lot of flavour and is almost necessary for flavour in some cases. It imparts a variety of differences, it gives colour, and this is why some, if not most, beer is a shade of golden amber. There's really no workaround to the presence of grain in beer. Hops are something we can actually question much more clearly. This is because beer was originally not made with hops, but ale was. Instead, something called gruit, or it was a herb and spice flavouring mix, was used. Strictly speaking, this is compliant with traditional beer recipes and styles, but will not always comply with beer definitions and standards if it is not labelled or sold as traditional beer. This is one of those distinctions. Something historically accurate can be called what it was historically, so long as you're clearly identifying it as such, but not if you're simply selling it as that product. This is why, technically, hops aren't needed, but they are useful, especially looking at things like longevity of storage and balancing flavours. Knowing what beer is defined as makes things just a bit clearer. So far we have a grain base with a flavouring added to it and generally used as a preservative. But there are some further classifications. Craft beer is perhaps the most common distinction you may come across. These are often premium beers that are sold locally or from a small-scale brewery, often in smaller batches and made to a particular style or intent. They're nearly always going to have three things in common: small, independently owned, and using some sort of traditional recipe. Different organizations are going to define these three things very differently. Some will use a volume produced each year, whether that is litres, barrels, and so on. Others look at market share ownership. How much of the market is a given brewery selling to and controlling? In a similar line of reasoning, how much of the brewery is owned by independent operators? That is there a large corporation with a vested interest? Traditional was one that we struggled with a lot because traditional, in the terms used often for craft brewing, are not what we think of as traditional. In some cases, it is referring to those things that have been used historically. In other cases, it's innovative brewing techniques or ingredients. These are your diverse flavors, things like the addition of fruits, for instance. Those three areas are generally what define a craft beer as distinct from a commercial beer. It's why the piss in a bottle known as Budweiser is not a craft beer, but some others are. With regards to yeast, the big differences are again going to go back to that historical and traditional use. Ale yeast and lager yeast pretty much define your two major beer types, and the use of those two particular classifications of yeast is nearly always going to be essential to make actual beer if it's going to be labelled as such. What you buy when you go to a store will most likely have been made using those. The thing coming out of the tap at a pub should be made using one of those two broad classifications. Exactly what yeast is doing what will vary, as you'll get different kinds of yeast for different kinds of ale and or lager. Beer as we know it is not exactly well defined, but it does have a narrower scope than some beverages. One of the big tricks to this is the general basics of it in the form of grains cover a wide area of cereal crops, but only some are suitable for malting, and these in turn limit options again. You then have to look at what flavors, or at least ingredients, are going to balance out the sweetness of malting. Hops was always a good option because it had that bitter flavor, but it also had complexity behind it. That did not mean that the use of gruit for centuries wasn't an option. Overall, beer is relatively simple. The right yeast, the right grains, and the right hops, or something similar to flavor. This is why you can brew low hops beers. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.